my name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. As the crow flies, Copenhagen is not far from Paris, less than 2 hours by plane. When it comes to climate politics, however, the distance traveled from the Danish to the French capitals between COP15, the UN Conference of the Parties in 2009, and COP21, the meeting set for the end of 2015, is probably best measured in light years. In a previous segment, we traced the first 2.5 decades of the negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, from its unveiling at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 to the creation of the Kyoto Protocol and the build-up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit. Let's pick up the thread of this remarkable and dramatic story. In early 2007, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, issued its fourth major report since 1990. Synthesizing thousands of peer-reviewed studies, each of these assessments has incrementally gained in authority as it measured past climate change and projected into the future. The IPCC's raison d'être, remember, is to provide a scientific basis for political decisions. The new report's main conclusions rang with certitude rare in scientific research. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, it announced to the world. That's 100%, no ifs, ands, or buts. And most of the increase in global temperatures seen so far, it continued, was very likely due to anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. In IPCC jargon, very likely meant at least 90% sure. The list of predicted impacts, meanwhile, had grown, both in variety and severity. Within the arena of the climate negotiations, these dire warnings created a sense of urgency, fueled in part by influential environmental groups, NGOs, policy institutes, and think tanks. Because the more than 190 nations grouped under the UNFCCC had set themselves a 2009 deadline for crafting a comprehensive climate pact, this energy and anxiety focused like a laser beam on the year-end meeting in the Danish capital. It was, in the minds of many, the rendezvous that would save the world. At the same time, vested interests and their political allies sought to slow, even obstruct progress towards a new global economy less dependent on the fossil fuels that caused global warming. Distorting the scientific method, they launched public campaigns highlighting the 10 or 2% of uncertainty rather than the growing mountain of evidence that the planet was veering into dangerous waters. It is hard to know how much damage they caused. But overall, expectations remained sky high going into the Copenhagen summit. Fail here, we heard time and again, and all is lost. In hindsight, it is easy to see that COP15 was never going to deliver on its promise. We can point to at least two major reasons why the rift between rich and developing countries was not yet ready to be closed. The first was differing perspectives on common but differentiated responsibility. This bedrock principle of the Convention says that all nations shall contribute to the fight against climate change, but that highly industrialized ones, historically responsible for global warming, must take the lead and help poor countries cope with impacts. While all parties had embraced this idea in theory, translating it into action proved very difficult. The Kyoto Protocol, under which some 36 rich nations took on legal commitments to slash greenhouse gas emissions, had been fatally weakened from the outset by the failure of the United States to ratify. That it would never become the vehicle for fixing the problem became even more apparent when emerging giants outside its purview, China, India, Brazil, and others, became major carbon polluters in their own right. In 2009, only 15% of global emissions were covered by Kyoto. Fundamental disagreement also persisted on what form any agreement should take. As we have noted, the UN climate talks were pulled in two competing directions on this question from the beginning. Towards a legally binding treaty, such as the Montreal Protocol on the one side, and towards a bottom-up voluntary system of national pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the other. Developing nations and their civil society allies demanded nothing short of a binding, enforceable treaty that would apply only to rich nations already grouped under the Kyoto Protocol, along with the United States. At the same time, China, India, Brazil, and most developing nations insisted that their carbon-cutting efforts must, under the principle of differentiated responsibility, remain voluntary. Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo, on the other hand, countered that all nations must be included under a single roof, and if emerging giants would not sign on to binding commitments, then terms would be voluntary for everyone. And so things remained deadlocked, right up to the moment when more than 110 heads of state, to this day no one is sure exactly how many came, descended on Copenhagen to sign a deal, make a speech, take a picture, and go home. Instead, they had to roll up their sleeves and paste together a 3-page document that came to be known as the Copenhagen Accord. Measured against what were clearly unrealistic expectations, Copenhagen was probably a failure. It was certainly a diplomatic fiasco. But several concrete achievements did emerge from the chaos. One was the target of preventing average global temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius, formally adopted as a goal a year later in Cancun. The fact that Copenhagen Accord failed to specify the pre-industrial benchmark is a clue as to how hastily the agreement was slapped together. The other was a pledge to mobilize at least $100 billion per year from 2020 to help poor countries curb their emissions and cope with climate change impacts. Both targets were as much political in origin as they were scientific or economic, but they have served as a foundation for further building. In 2011, the European Union succeeded in cajoling reluctant parties, including China, India, and the United States, into setting a 2015 deadline for a comprehensive climate deal that would go into effect 5 years later in 2020. Subsequent ministerial meetings of the UNFCCC in Doha, Warsaw, and Lima were mostly preparations for that Paris summit, which is only weeks away as I speak. We'll revisit this space once it is over to report on the results. But what we can do here is identify 5 of the most contentious points that will determine the quality of the outcome. The first is money. The $100 billion Copenhagen pledged left all the details to be worked out. Is it mostly for mitigation or adaptation? How much must come from public sources and how much can be private? What's an acceptable split between grants and loans? Who exactly qualifies for funding? Will there be a guarantee that the overall amount will increase each year? If so, by how much? Each of these highly contentious issues is wide open to debate. Separately, there is another money-related bone of contention that goes under the label of loss and damage. Helping the world's most vulnerable nations, small island states slipping under the waves, African states decimated by drought, adapt to climate change is one thing. But who is going to pay, they ask, for impacts already underway? To the United States and Europe, that sounds like compensation, which is a term and a concept they really don't like. Second point, a major pillar of the Paris Agreement are voluntary national pledges to cut greenhouse gases, known in climate jargon as intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs for short. More than 150 countries, covering 90% of global emissions, have submitted plans so far. But scientists say they only take us part way towards the 2-degree goal. Hence the need for a mechanism to periodically review and ratchet up these pledges. But how often? And how will efforts be measured and verified? Third point. Since Copenhagen, rich nations have tried to update the principle of differentiated responsibilities that divided the world into 2 camps when it comes to action on climate change. Developed countries acknowledge that much has changed since that notion was enshrined in the convention in 1992, but say it must remain essentially intact. Between these 2 positions lies a battleground, and the fighting could get intense. Number 4. How hot is too hot? Poor and vulnerable nations, that will get hit first and hardest by global warming are pushing for a 1.5 degree cap on temperature rise rather than 2. Judging by the impacts already visible with less than a degree of warming, they say 2.0 is just not good enough. They occupy the moral high ground, but that's not likely to provide enough leverage to carry the day. Finally, number 5, in most cases, the INDCs don't go beyond 2030. This is a problem. Policy planners say we need goals stretching out to at least mid-century in order to engineer at a national level the transformation of low or zero carbon economies. Humanity must learn, they say, to live within its carbon budget, the total amount of fossil fuels we can burn before punching through the 2-degree ceiling into a world of dangerous warming. At the current rate, we'll use up our allowance within about 3 decades. It boils down to this. By 2050, with some 9 billion people crowding the planet, each of them, on average, must not generate more than 2 tons CO2 pollution every year. How that long-term goal is formulated, phase out of fossil fuels, decarbonization, deep decarbonization, transition to a low-carbon economy, is important, albeit largely symbolic. While attention is focused on the arena of the UN talks, most of the market-moving discussions are taking place elsewhere. 2 Sino-US summits in the last year have played a key role in setting the agenda, as have at least a dozen other bilateral meetings. G7 and G20 summits are also venues where political decisions beyond the pay grade of rank-and-file negotiators are made. To get a better grasp of the background of the run-up to the COP21 Climate Summit in Paris, we spoke to Alden Meyer, who is Chief Scientist at the Union for Concerned Scientists based in Washington.
Copenhagen was intended to be a replacement for Kyoto, basically something that would broaden the regime, would be legally binding, would be more ambitious, and would be comprehensive, would include all countries, and obviously it fell short. There was not a legally binding agreement that came out at the end. What came out was the Copenhagen Accord, which was a call on countries to make voluntary pledges of action. And of course you had the US, India, China, other major emitters even before the Copenhagen Summit started, putting their pledges on the table, which was a good thing. And those were deviations from business as usual, so it wasn't just pro forma. They were actually significant proposals. But of course, Copenhagen itself was perceived as a failure because of the chaos and sort of the collapse of the negotiations at the end, and the fact that the heads of government, heads of state themselves had to come in and craft this 3-page Copenhagen Accord in a pretty divisive political environment. Unfortunately, I was an inside advisor to the Danish climate and energy minister, and on her team providing some informal advice, and so I saw this from the inside. There were some pretty big splits between Connie Hedegaard, who was the climate and energy minister, and her prime minister and his key advisor, and so the government wasn't unified, which didn't help. You also, of course, this was right after the meltdown in the mortgage markets in the US and the global economic crisis. And so people were very nervous about the economic implications of what they might be negotiating. That didn't help. I think that we were still in a very turbulent economic framework. Of course, you also had President Obama, who was in his first year. You had the Waxman-Markey legislation pass the House, but had not yet passed the Senate. So there were just a lot of moving pieces here, which I think meant the stars didn't really align for Copenhagen. But the good news is we did get this regime of voluntary pledges for 2020, which now have sort of evolved into what are called the INDCs, or intended nationally determined contributions, that are going to be the building blocks of the Paris Agreement.
Just one last question about Copenhagen. The $100 billion a year figure starting in 2020 for developing countries. How did that arise? How did that get into the...
Well, I think that was actually, it was a politically driven number. It wasn't based on any analysis or need. I mean, you could look at the analyses that were out there at the time by the World Bank or by Oxfam or by other organizations in terms of both adaptation and mitigation, and the numbers were much higher, that you really needed more money than that on an annual basis to really fund the kind of transition in the global economy and to fund a dramatic ramp up in investments in climate resilience. But it was a large number. It was an attention-getting number. It was significantly larger than the then current flows of climate finance, and I think it had the desired political effect, which was to convince particularly vulnerable countries, least developed countries, AOSIS and small island states and others in this process, that they had something to gain from an outcome in Copenhagen. And you've got to remember, this was at a time when the United States and other developed countries were pretty single-mindedly focused on getting China and other major developing countries to agree to the same transparency and reporting requirements that the industrialized countries had under Kyoto. So that was one of the drivers here. The driver was to put a fairly significant financial pledge on the table to create a dynamic where a number of developing countries would think they had a stake in a positive outcome, and that would help convince China, India, and others that they should not block an agreement in Copenhagen. It was largely, I think, a strategy that was aimed at a particular outcome, and on that level it succeeded.
So here are a few tips for covering the policy or political side of the climate story. Number one, take the time or find the time to have deep background discussions with some of your sources. It's really worth taking an hour to dig in deep on a topic, even if you're not going to be writing about it in the short term. Because later on, when you are on deadline, that conversation may prove extremely useful. And it's really sometimes the only way to wrap your mind around this very complicated story. Here's another tip. In covering this story, learn the lingo. These talks have been going on for more than 20 years now and have developed an arcane and complicated vocabulary all of their own. It's not reasonable to expect that a journalist would learn all of it, but you should know the basics because otherwise you may run the risk of not understanding that overheard conversation, which could give you a big story. Here's a third tip. Don't give short shrift to the adaptation side of this story, that is, how countries cope with impacts. For the most part, mainstream media have focused on the mitigation side, that is, emissions reduction. But adaptation has always been a crucial pillar of these talks and will be even more so an important element as we go forward. Finally, if you're not doing it already, use social networks as a resource. As is true in virtually every domain now, these have become an important platform for finding information, especially Twitter. So use it, because sometimes the news comes out first and sometimes exclusively on these platforms. So here are a few important points to remember when we're talking about the background of the UN negotiations on climate change. Number one, the key issues going into the Paris Climate Summit are money, how to ramp up emissions-cutting ambition, the framing of a long-term goal, and how to revisit the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Number two, don't lose sight of the fact that most key decisions related to the UN climate negotiations take place outside of the UNFCCC arena. Frontline negotiators are extremely knowledgeable, but they have very limited mandates. Number three, lessons the French host of COP21 say they learned from Copenhagen. A treaty is a non-starter. Don't bring heads of state at the end of a COP. Get ministers and heads of state involved early in the process so they know the issues when it comes to crunch time. And number four, while most issues split along the developing national divide, there are some that do not, especially now. You should be aware of new alignments and alliances as you cover this story.